Behind this heavy apartment door, a horrific series of crimes that would span 13 years went entirely undetected. When investigators breached Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment in 1991, they found evidence of crude chemical laboratories, the systematic dissolution of human remains in acid, and cannibalism. But this building represents a different conclusion. During his 1992 trial at the Milwaukee County Courthouse, despite undisputed forensic evidence of extreme mental illness, a jury ultimately found Dahmer sane and legally accountable. The trial centered on the concept of mens rea, the guilty mind, the conscious cognitive intent required to commit a crime. The deconstruction of this case reveals a critical distinction. Clinical pathology does not automatically equate to legal insanity. To understand how 17 victims died over 13 years, we have to map the exact boundary between a sick mind and a legally responsible one. The cultural archetype of the serial killer usually points toward the classic psychopath, but Dahmer lacked the behavioral architecture common to that profile. Looking at this diagnostic matrix, classic psychopathy relies on traits like superficial charm, social agility, and a sadistic drive for power. Dahmer, by contrast, was severely withdrawn, socially awkward, and expressed deep self-loathing. The foundation of his pathology traces back to a different clinical framework. At age 4, an invasive hernia surgery triggered profound dissociation. This, compounded by severe emotional neglect during his developmental years, resulted in severe borderline personality disorder, complicated by comorbid schizotypal personality disorder. The defining feature of borderline personality disorder is a paralyzing fear of abandonment. For Dahmer, the terror of rejection was absolute. His comorbid schizotypal disorder introduced delusional thinking into this fear, providing the cognitive framework for his attempts to create zombies through chemical injections. He did not kill to exert temporary sadistic control. His necrophilia was an evolution of his abandonment terror. A corpse represented a partner physically incapable of leaving him. A pathological motive does not explain a 13-year span of impunity. We have to ask how such severe pathology could operate unchecked for over a decade. The data shows a deliberate predatory calculus. The majority of his 17 victims were young gay men of Black, Latino, and Asian descent. He targeted marginalized populations, recognizing that their disappearances were more likely to be ignored or superficially investigated by authorities. By 1990, his compulsions had escalated within the isolation of his residence at the Oxford Apartments in Milwaukee. The consequences of systemic bias culminated on May 26, 1991. 14-year-old Conrad Synthesum, heavily drugged and injured, managed to escape the apartment and reach the street. 3 Black female witnesses found the child and called 911, explicitly requesting medical intervention. When officers arrived, Dahmer intercepted them. He exploited the officers' prejudices by framing the incident as a domestic dispute with an adult lover. The officers accepted his narrative. They dismissed the witnesses, waved off paramedics, and escorted the boy back into the apartment without running a background check. A single query would have revealed Dahmer was a registered sex offender on probation for molesting Conrad's older brother. Within 30 minutes of the police leaving, the child was murdered. Institutional myopia functioned as an inadvertent shield for the predator. The violence ended 2 months later when Tracy Edwards, pictured here, thought his way out of the apartment and flagged down a patrol car. Following his arrest, Dahmer freely confessed to all 17 murders. Because the physical acts were uncontested, the subsequent legal proceedings moved into a specialized phase. Wisconsin employs a bifurcated trial procedure. Having pleaded guilty in the first phase, the trial moved to a secondary phase focusing on his mental state. In this phase, the burden of proof shifted to the defense. They had to prove that a mental disease rendered him unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct. The defense strategy relied on narrative distance. By keeping Dahmer off the witness stand, they prevented the jury from forming a personal impression of his character, ensuring the only available framework for his behavior was the clinical psychiatric narrative provided by their expert witnesses. Defense psychiatrists argued that his necrophilia was a mental disease that completely hijacked his behavior, transforming his acts into uncontrollable biological compulsions. The prosecution countered this through the testimony of forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Elliott Dietz. Dietz agreed that Dahmer was severely mentally ill, but demonstrated that this did not negate his legal intent. To dismantle the defense of uncontrollable compulsions, Dietz presented evidence of sustained cognitive control. The first pillar of this framework was preparation. Dahmer premeditatively ground up sleeping pills well before he went out, ensuring his sedatives were ready to deploy immediately. The second pillar was risk mitigation. He actively avoided targeting men who owned vehicles. Knowing an abandoned car near his apartment would serve as traceable evidence for police. The final pillar was concealment. He utilized calculated methods to destroy physical evidence and lied effortlessly to law enforcement to avoid capture. While the pathology was indisputable, this framework proved he could plan, execute, and temporarily halt his behavior to avoid detection. He possessed the cognitive faculties required for legal accountability. The jury concluded that Dietz possessed the capacity to conform his behavior to the law, rejecting the insanity defense. He was sentenced to 15 life terms, totaling 957 years in prison. His incarceration ended in 1994 when he was killed in a prison bathroom by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver, seen here. While Dahmer met a sudden end, the trauma of the case lingered. Tracy Edwards, the man who initiated the arrest, suffered a psychological collapse, drifting into homelessness and eventually facing his own murder conviction years later. The verdict reinforced a standard in forensic jurisprudence. A defendant can suffer from crippling paraphilic disorders, yet still retain the cognitive faculties required for legal accountability. The case illustrates how profound developmental attachment deficits can mutate into lethal compulsions. However, his ability to act on those compulsions for over a decade remains a historical indictment of the systemic prejudices allowing violence to flourish unchecked.